Hey everyone! Welcome to the second episode of our MagicaVoxel Tutorial Series. Today, we're going to start modeling this cozy little house from scratch. We'll begin with simple block shapes, focus on composition, and gradually refine the structure. Not only will I walk you through the MagicaVoxel tools that I use, but also I'll share insights into my personal creative workflow. This isn't just about technical steps, it's about how I approach voxel art, experiment with ideas, and bring my projects to life. There are always different ways to do things, and I'm sure some people might have faster or easier methods, but this is my way of working. If you're interested in seeing how I create, grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. Before we jump into modeling, I want to quickly talk about my two main approaches to building in MagicaVoxel. Sometimes I like to start from scratch, just playing around with big chunks of cubes without worrying much about colors or details at first. Some of the times I import highly detailed assets from my old work and adjust them based on my vision. It really depends on my mood and the idea I have in mind. But for my isometric house series, for example, the one we're gonna be doing in this tutorial, I usually begin with basic shapes to build a strong foundation before adding details. Alright, let's set up our MagicaVoxel workspace for better control over the scene size. At this stage, I just want to block out the main forms and get a sense of how everything fits together. I like to start big, so I set my object size to 256 by 256, which is also the maximum limit of a single object in MagicaVoxel. So now here I'm just picking a basic color and then fill my object, fill the whole object. Next, I switch to word mode to set up my scene. To estimate the size, I quickly add some cubes to define the borders of my base. So here I'm just simply holding shift and clicking drag with the left mouse button. So shift and drag, it's gonna duplicate your object. So I'm just gonna add some more cubes to shape the initial structure that I might think that I like. At this point, it's more about experimenting, you know, what looks good to you, what feels right to you. Once I'm a bit into modeling, I like to see how it looks rendered. So I set up a basic render and rough lighting. If half your model disappears when you render, it's because sparse under geometry is off. Turn it on to make sure your entire model is visible. For this video, I'm keeping the lighting setup simple, but in the upcoming videos, I'll dive deeper into how I approach lighting in detail. The focus here is purely on modeling. I usually prefer working with a darker background because it makes my model pop and stand out. So now this is just a matter of finding the perfect outline, finding the best foundation and base for the house. So I keep moving around objects, I keep rendering to see how it's looking. If you want to save a camera angle, you go down here with this camera presets. You choose a number and then you press 7 on the keyboard. And then when you want to load that shot, you just press 8. This is actually super useful for switching between views without losing your perfect shots. Okay, now I'm just gonna make some quick stills to see how the structure would look. So now I'm just mostly playing around with shapes, experimenting to see what works. The tools I use the most are box, face, voxel, and geometry. Things like spheres and other basic forms. Here I'm just exploring different shapes to find something that I like. I change my mind a lot during the process. I try different things, experiment with shapes, and sometimes I just ditch entire sections if they don't feel right. I test, tweak, and rebuild until something clicks. Right now I'm using the geometry tool, specifically the circle geometry tool, to create an arch. If you're familiar with my work, you've probably noticed that I use arches a lot. I honestly don't know where this obsession comes from, but there's just something about these voxelated cute little arches that hits different. I render often while working because it helps me check how the model looks with lighting and rendering. Seeing it come together in real time allows me to make better adjustments, so I constantly check the rendered version. I think I need a little window on this other side wall. So I just copy paste the other arch that I had. I'm gonna place it in the right spot. If I want to have a brush in the shape of my arch, I just fill the empty space with another color, and then I select that color and I create a pattern brush. Want to use the pattern brush, you press P on the keyboard. The same main tools that we always use, you can also use it with pattern brush. So I'm gonna hollow out this cube right here, copy paste it so we have another little window on the other side so we get some light inside. Let's move around these arches because they were looking too flat and too boring. So I'd like to add some volume to the whole thing. Maybe tweak with the size of the arch a little bit here to see how it looks. I think this is gonna be some kind of like an entrance to the house, maybe. I'm using a shader to create stairs here to speed up my process. Instead of manually just sculpting each step, this shader helps me generate a structured stair shape quickly, saving a ton of time. If you don't know what shaders are, don't worry, I'll cover them in depth in another video. But for now, I'll drop a link in the description so you can get them all. Setting them up is super easy. Just download the shader, place it inside the shaders folder in your MagicaVoxel location, and you're good to go. So for the trees, I'm using Realistic Voxel 3 Asset Pack, which you can find in the link below. But if you prefer, you can create your own in Blender or any other 3D program and just import them in OBJ format. You can also model trees directly in MagicaVoxel if that's your style. Thanks to ModeVis, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but yeah, thanks to him and this asset pack, I can quickly drop in realistic voxel trees. This pack comes with a guide, so you can go through the options, pick the one you like, and simply drag and drop it into your project. The only limitation with this is the single object size limit in Magica. This works fine for most projects, but since I usually create huge scenes, I often find that this size isn't enough for the scale I need. As a workaround, this is how I scale up trees. I cut the model in half, scale each half individually, and then stitch them back together. Also, one thing I really love about voxel trees and foliage in general is how they look from different distances. From afar, they can look surprisingly realistic, especially when they have a lot of detail. But when you get up close, you start to see all these little tiny cubes, which I think makes them even more cute. Once the pieces are aligned, I group them as a single object using Ctrl+R. That way, I can move it around easily as a single unit, just like any other object. When you're in work mode, you'll notice a layer panel on the left, next to your color palette. This is super useful for keeping everything organized. I use it all the time to separate different elements. For example, placing foliage in one layer and buildings in another. This way, you can toggle layers on and off, making it much easier to manage your scene and keep control over everything. Alright, now let's add another tree to bring in more variation. To keep things from looking too boring, I rotate, flip, and rescale the trees, creating a more dynamic and natural look. The foliage composition is looking good so far, but I'm not a fan of this little one branch sticking out. It's kind of distracting. So I'll jump into the voxel tool, erase the parts that feel out of place, and clean it up a bit. Now let's build some simple wooden windows. Since windows are usually symmetrical, I use the face and box tools in mirror mode. This speeds up the process and keeps everything neat and balanced. We're gonna add details later. Right now it's just about getting the base structure and checking the scale. It's easy to get lost in details. I do too sometimes. But it helps to remind yourself to focus on the bigger picture first and come back to details later. When I don't want to freehand everything, I use this simple technique. I select the shape that I want, like this arch for example, scale it down slightly, give it a new color using I on the keyboard, then select and delete the color. This leaves me with a perfect outline for the shape that I need. The selection tool is also really handy. You can select, copy, paste, scale, or recolor any part of your model quickly. I'm just populating the scene with the windows that I just made, adjusting their size to fit the arches. Copy-pasting elements not only speeds up the process, but also it keeps everything visually consistent. I really didn't like how the big windows looked for the door, so I'm creating this custom arch instead. Let's see how it fits. Let's add a small garden to bring in some life. I also try to work evenly across the whole scene instead of focusing too much on one part at a time. Keeping everything at the same level of detail really helps with overall consistency, except for the trees of course, since they're already detailed because I imported them. But for anything I'm creating from scratch, I follow this basic to detailed approach to keep everything balanced. Now let's adjust everything a bit more. It's starting to come together. Now let's create a small balcony railing. I'm using the Vox tool, slowly shaping it into something simple yet visually interesting. Here's a cool tool I want to show you. I think it's called Wrap. It's super useful when you have a base object and you want to just repeat it seamlessly. Go to the transform tool on the left under the transform panel. This tool lets you repeat your shape in any direction. For example, if you drag the little scaling cube, it automatically tiles your geometry along all axes. It's a huge time saver and I use it a lot, especially when working with larger scenes where I need to stitch objects together seamlessly. When stitching objects together, it's important to pay attention to the borders, how each object connects and aligns, so everything looks smooth and cohesive. Alright, let's start adding more details. I think if I add bigger arches and define the edges a bit more, it'll make the building visually more interesting. For example, the arch I want to create here is larger than 256, so I'll use the same technique I used for the trees. I cut the arch in two, scale up each half, then copy paste and flip to create a seamless larger arch. I think it's looking pretty good, but I'm not loving this small window over here. Let's get rid of it. The balcony railing looked too harsh in that brown color, so I'm just gonna recolor it. Now let's create a fountain. Instead of making a new shape from scratch, I'll copy paste the one I already used for the garden border. Next, I'll add a solid blue placeholder to represent our water. Don't worry, this won't be the final look. Here I am again getting lost in details, which I know I shouldn't do. I really need to stick to my own advice, but sometimes I just can't help myself. Like with this balcony railing, it looks way too bulky and awkward. I just have to fix it. Just a small touch of detail already elevates the whole look, making it feel more polished and realistic. The fountain looks a bit too big, so I'm adjusting the size to make sure it fits well with the rest of the scene. Now let's move on to the roof. I go to the shape tool in the edit panel, create a simple pyramid and color it just to make it easier to work with. The diagonal tool in the edit panel is also super handy for creating slanted shapes. I rotate the pyramid on the Z-axis, position it over the building and adjust the size. Place the pyramid and use the wrap tool to repeat the base shape. And just like that, the roof is done. I group all the objects together to check how it looks. Now let's add some extra details to the roof. I start with a basic cylinder, then scale up the scene so I can use dilate effectively. I hollow out the cylinder using hull, delete the top and bottom faces, then dilate it to give it more volume. Once I get the right shape, I delete the bottom half, resize it, and go back to my favorite tool, the repeat function. The base looks good, but it's still a bit large, so I scale it down to 0.8. Again, now that I'm happy with the size, I'm just gonna copy paste it all over to form the final roof pattern. Now let's rotate it slightly to match the roof's angle. Perfect. Next, I use the diagonal tool again to create the edges and this angle right here. Then mirror it to get the other side. Same process for both sides. Once everything looks good, I group all the objects together and the roof is done. Now let's add a simple chimney using a basic cube. I use the same hold, delete and dilation technique to give it shape. Looks good for now. At this point, unfortunately, I lost about 45 to 50 minutes of footage, which only recorded a black screen. So I don't exactly remember everything that I did, but the most important parts were modeling this fountain centerpiece. So here I used the sphere tool, hollowed it out, deleted the face and dilated it. Then copy-pasted, resized, and added a few details. When working with dilating, make sure to size up your working area before doing it, or you're gonna get these unwanted flat edges. And then I added a mini supportive arch to the balcony here, right here. So for this, I used the geometry tool, created a sphere, extruded it, deleted parts until I had just a quarter left. Then I used hold, delete, dilate to shape it. Before wrapping up, let's refine our scene a little bit more and just take a look at what we've built so far. Okay, that's it for now. In the next tutorial, we'll focus on texturing and a little bit of lighting. I didn't go deep into lighting here because I didn't want to overwhelm you. But trust me, lighting is crucial. I'll be making a dedicated video on advanced lighting, but for now, we'll focus on texturing and some basic lighting adjustment in the next tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.